understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you there? It is time for the podcast. And this podcast, we're going to go back to something we did a while back, John, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which I'm not sure exactly when we did. I think it was November last year. We did a four part. So if you're interested in that, go back to November. And we did a 4, even 5-part series on the history of the conflict, on the progression of the conflict, and on where it seemed the conflict was going. And this was 5 or 6 months ago. They're well worth having a listen to. This podcast has been triggered, of course, by the recognition on the part of Ireland of the state of Palestine, the Palestinian state, which is a huge move in Irish foreign policy. And it's a really, really big move. It means that we're no longer genuflecting, or we might have been genuflecting to Washington, because the Americans would not have liked this, but nor too would Brussels have liked this, because the EU has not made anything other than highly supportive statements on the part of Israel. So Ireland, Norway, which again has its own foreign policy, and Spain have now moved to recognise the Palestinian state. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this, John, in the total round, right? Where is it likely to take us? What's the history? What's the objective? What I would say, though, is that foreign policy, Lord Castlereagh, the great English negotiator for the Brits on a whole, totally and utterly scurrilous and mendacious, but brilliant negotiator, like our friend Talleyrand for Napoleon, right? Basically said, countries have no friends, they have interests. And that was his basic idea, that foreign policy isn't about who you're most friendly with. It's actually about where do my interests lie? And it's like a big game of chess. And in the last, certainly 30 or 40 years, Irish foreign policy has been, I think, very successfully enmeshed with Irish commercial / industrial policy. So economic policy and foreign policy have been enmeshed in a way in which is not the case in big countries. So big countries have a clear distinction between their economy and their political foreign objectives, usually bolstered by, or at least backed up by, a military prowess, legacy or power. Small countries, because we are rule takers in the main, we're never rule makers, our foreign policy is a much more deft, opaque, hopefully, I would think, longer-sighted idea that, where do we sit in the world? It's this idea of the soft power, John. Like, how do you get the world, when you can't force people to do your bidding because you're small, how do you get the world to think like you? To create a brand in people's heads. Oh, that's the Irish brand. That's where we are. Okay, I get that. It's the power of persuasion. So that's why to be a diplomat or a diplomatic corps in a smaller country is a much more difficult job than in a rich country. And then you have to say, so we can't make the rules. So we take the rules. That's fine. Okay. And then we make best the rules we take, or we try to adapt best. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, we can't really affect the world. So what is our foreign policy for? I can understand what American foreign policy is, because they can affect things, or Russian foreign policy, or Chinese foreign policy. But when it gets to small countries, what's it for? And I suppose it's for, number one, to express the moral position of the country. And that's where this latest move is. What do we as a country think about the world? And what side do we feel we should be on, right? And this is, I think, very much this latest move in Ireland, right? But then the other part is, where do our interests lie? It's a more cynical, it's a more fragmented idea, which is that who do you do trade with? Who do you do business with? Where do your immigrants come from? Where does your industry come from? All that sort of things. And what we've done in Ireland is we've outsourced most of that to the EU. So the interesting thing about foreign policy is, joining the European Union, you're joining a club, and the club say, well, here's our rules, and we set them collectively as a gang. You're part of the gang now, so you go with our rules. So
you also have an opportunity, and that's why we've got European elections coming up, to input into those, the making of those rules.
So it's a democratic process, and you go in and you say, look, we're broadly, ideologically and socially and economically and politically aligned with your values, the European Union. So we're broadly going to be on the same page on most things. So what that does is it gives small countries enormous power, because for so long, small countries have always been terrorized by what I call the tyranny of size. That when you get into a scrap and you're small, you get slapped around,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
So the tyranny of size is something that you can militate against by getting into bed with bigger fellas, right? It's a general strategy. So then you think, okay, so we have a moral foreign policy, but we have a collective foreign policy. We have interests. Those interests might not necessarily always equate with moralism. And as a general rule, it all comes together, right? What I'm seeing now is that the government has moved to say, morally, we are on the side of the Palestinians, full stop, which I think is probably the right thing to do, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure it doesn't come with a cost. So this podcast is all going to be like, what might be the potential cost of this move? I know you think it's just pure cynicism.
Well, you see, when this news broke last week, my first instinct was, yeah, absolutely, that's the right thing to do.
Just recognise the Palestine state, full stop.
Absolutely, because after all, you can't have a two-state solution without having two states to begin with.
Yeah.
So on that point, absolutely. And I've been debating this with all my mates on WhatsApp and all the WhatsApp has gone bananas. But on the flip side of that, I can't help feeling a little uncomfortable with the timing. I'm not sure if the timing is pure electioneering or if it is the right timing to actually up the game against Israel and show Israel, actually, lads, what you're doing is not on.
Yeah.
But, you know, as you say, where does it take us? Now, why didn't we, from a timing perspective, Sweden recognized, for instance,
years ago,
on 2014, why didn't we recognize Palestine then? You know,
because there wasn't a European election. Is that what you're saying? You said they could be so cynical, John. I can't believe it.
But why not? Why didn't we do it back then? Like our allegiance or our empathy, maybe is a better word, with the Palestinian and the Palestinian cause has been there for years. It's just now kind of ramped up and it's now...
Yeah, because of what's happening in Gaza.
Yes, exactly. But why didn't we recognize them before now?
You know what I'm worried about? Whether being Irish now requires people to be anti-Israeli in the way when we were younger, being Irish, we were anti-Brits. We're against those lot over there, right?
Yeah,
and we defined ourselves by what we were against in many ways. And I wonder if one of the roads we're going down is this bizarre road that, you know, being anti-Israeli. Now, I was watching something the other night on Twitter. I know I keep calling it Twitter. I'm very old-fashioned, right? And there was a situation in a cinema in East London, I think it was last week, right? Where the cinema was hosting a Israeli documentary made about the October 7th Nova Festival.
Yeah.
Right? So they had all these Israeli Jewish supporters, and of course they had anti-Israeli supporters, right? So they're all Star of Davis on one side, Palestinian flags on the other.
Yeah.
Except there was 3 tricolours.
Yeah.
Irish tricolours on the Palestinian side. And I'm thinking, is that where we're going now? That to be Irish, or not to be Irish, but one of the expressions, the general expression of Irishness is to be anti-Israeli. And that's
I hope not.
I really hope not.
Yeah.
But my point is that where we're going? So, I mean, we're having this very, and again, just to yourself, the listener, John and I are having this very, very open discussion about where these policies are going to take us. I mean, the interesting thing, the fascinating thing is, do you know the only international leader, the only one who's entitled to an Irish passport?
Who's that?
It's the President of Israel, which is kind of mad when you think of it.
Right.
Herzog, Bougie Herzog, Isaac Herzog's dad was born here.
Because of the Jack Charlton rule.
Yeah, for rabbis. You know,
wow, that's amazing.
So Chaim Herzog, the first president of Israel, was born in this country, right?
Yeah.
And his dad was the chief rabbi, was known as the Sinn Féin rabbi, who could speak Irish and was a complete Republican,
right?
Completely into Irish independence, which is why that there's a great link between that generation of Israeli, the founders of the Israeli state, Herzog and all those guys, right? Did very close links to the IRA, to the Irish national movement, because they saw in the Irish national liberation movement in the 1916 and thereafter, right? Yeah. A model of how you could extract concessions from the Brits, because the Brits ruled Palestine at the time.
Yeah.
So they had actually, so much so that Menachem Begin, who was the man who actually created the Likud party, of which Netanyahu is now the head.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a different party, but he created it. And it was based on the thoughts of a guy called Jabotinsky, who was a very notable figure in the Israeli firmament in the 1920s and 30s. But anyway, his code name was Michael, after Michael Collins, because their heroes were those IRA. So through Herzog, who is the president, who is the only foreign leader entitled to an Irish passport, there is this kind of odd link, and it goes back to this idea, Joyce talked about it, people talk about it at the turn of the 19th century when Zionism emerged. Herzog's, I think it was 1893, the Zionist conference in Basel in Switzerland, and Herzog comes up. Zionism was seen as the Jewish mirror image of nationalism everywhere in Europe. So it was seen as a fellow traveller of Irish nationalism, Czech nationalism, Slovakian nationalism, Yugoslavian nationalism, or Serbian, or whatever you want to call it at the time.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting that these ideas came from the same spring in a way. It was an anti-imperialist notion.
So what's happened then with the Irish-Israeli relationship? But hang on, just before you answer that, I mean, the whole thing about being anti-Israeli, I'm really uncomfortable with that.
Me too.
Because there's so many Israelis that are anti-Israeli. No, but
anti-Netanyahu,
Netanyahu. And this is more like being anti the right wing, the Israeli right wing, extremists.
I think so. Well,
and it's extremists against Palestinian extremists, which is Hamas.
I think you're right. But a lot of people say, no, you're wrong. They'll say all Israelis deep down think the same way. They're all racist. They're all settlers. They're all colonists.
Well, that's what the Israelis say about the Palestinians.
I know.
Deep down, they're all the same. They're not.
I know. So what we have is this bizarre thing. It's just weird to think that this might become a trope for Irishness, or a internationally accepted, the Irish, they're very anti-Israeli, right? Or the Irish, they're very, very pro-Palestinian in every case.
Or what you're hearing now is the Irish are anti-Semitic, which is complete nonsense. That's a totally different argument.
That's a totally different argument. But what is interesting might be what you would call the Gazaization of Irish public policy, right? By that I mean, it seems that there is now an excessive, not concern. Concern's the wrong word. We are all concerned. But that we have moved to see the world through the prism of this conflict in a way that other countries kind of haven't. Other countries kind of haven't. Like you go to Italy and France and, even in Spain, where they've come out very much on the same side as us, there isn't the same public debate constantly. The Germans are totally compromised because they don't know what to do. Right, because they've got the Holocaust shame, and anything that's pro-Palestinian is now seen as, beyond the pale for the Germans. But even you take the Scandinavians, the Danes, what we're talking about is we have become much more aligned to the Palestinian cause, and I think it's the right thing to do, but I'm kind of worried where it might take us, because, it's like journeys are all great, but you've got to figure out your destination. Like, where are we actually going with this policy?
But where, let's go back to that question.
Okay. So if you look at the relations between Ireland and Israel, so there were, it seems to me, very warm relations on a sort of a bizarrely fraternal notion of both the Israelis and the Irish being anti-colonialist fighters. This is the weird thing where we've got to, right? So that's throughout the 1950s and 60s. There's no official recognition of each other. And the Israelis were obviously very, very prepared to have diplomatic relations with Ireland. But after the 1967 war, the Irish decided we would keep that on hold for a long time. Also, it's because Ireland didn't have diplomatic relations with lots of people because we couldn't afford the embassies. Like, it was a very simple idea. Like, we couldn't...
Really?
Yeah. If you think you're a small country, you can't be having 70 embassies. Right, they're expensive things. Like, now you don't think about these things. Yeah. But back then, when Ireland had no... You might have relations, but you wouldn't have the Department of Foreign Affairs.
A big old house somewhere on Aylesbury Road.
Yeah, exactly. And a couple of mercs, and, exactly. And some sort of ambassador geezer. You didn't have the money for that. But what has been fascinating is that Ireland and Israel have had diplomatic relations, like full embassies in either place, since the early 1990s. But what has changed is in the late 1960s and particularly into the 1970s, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, began to acquire and seek out relationships with the IRA. And there was always this proximity between the Republican movement and the Palestinian movement. And that was a thing we saw through the 70s. And it also helped that Gaddafi was given the Provost money and Gaddafi was supporting the PLO. So there was sort of the anti-imperialist movement. But ironically, in the beginning, Irish elites and Israeli elites saw themselves as fighting the same anti-imperial war, right? Which is kind of mad. Since the 80s, that's changed. And of course, since the 90s, that's changed profoundly. However, and this is the fascinating thing, do you know what is one of our fastest growing trade partners? Israel.
Really?
Ireland exports $1.83 billion worth of goods to Israel, and we import $3.8 billion.
Wow.
So we import...
That's quite a significant trade.
It's huge.
Yeah.
So ironically, just as Israel has been moving in the 1990s under the Netanyahu malignancy in an extreme direction, trade between Ireland and Israel has also been moving in an extreme direction the other way.
Yeah.
And the reason is the following. This comes back to my...
Sorry, just before you give me the reason there, what are we trading?
Now, I'll just break it down here. What are we trading? I'll give it to you now, because I'm looking at the OECD trade statistics, right? We export, 28% of our exports to Israel are broadcasting equipment.
Broadcasting equipment?
Listening devices, John. Who listens in Israel? Not the average punter.
They listen to the podcast, clearly.
Of course they listen to podcasts.
It's earbuds,
earbuds, right? Computers, integrated circuits, office machine parts, packaged medicines, all sorts, right?
Wow. So
that's what we export to them. So we have huge trade with the Israelis, and we import from them 89% are integrated circuits from computers.
I assume a lot of this is intertrade with the likes of Intel Israel and Intel Ireland. And
maybe,
that
yeah.
Kind of, I don't know.
Sure
I don't know. Yeah.
But it's a big figure.
Sure is.
You've combined, so interestingly, as diplomatic relations deteriorated, commercial relations expanded. So we're at this strange situation that, taken together, there's about 5 billion of euros of trade going between both countries, right? Which is a lot. So if we go down the sanctions road, we're going down that road. But what's probably more interesting is the idea of where the whole thing takes us as a country. And the reason Israel and Ireland have been doing so much trade is that their economies are so similar. Right. So Israel and Ireland both took massive bets on the tech sector in the early 1990s, both of us, right? We took a bet and we said to the Americans, we will host your best companies here. We will give you our best graduates. You will create your best products and we will take a big chunk of tax off you.
Yeah.
That was our thing. The Israelis said, we don't want your companies so much, well, we don't mind having them, but we'd really like your capital, your Silicon Valley capital, and we will create our own companies here and they will feed into your multinationals, right? But as a result of that, both countries have become, again, quite enmeshed in international trade together, as you said, by virtue of the fact that large tech companies are based both here and there. So there's a huge amount of trade and travel and integration and all that sort of stuff, right? And it means that in a bizarre way, both countries are moving together in a commercial way. Whereas in an intellectual way, in an emotional way, in a moral way, And in a geopolitical way, we are separating.
Yeah, but as you say there, a lot of the companies, both in Ireland and in Israel, are very much relying on America.
Absolutely.
And what I kind of wonder, I know this whole thing...
We are both America's lapdog.
Well, exactly.
That's the weird thing.
And when you hear somebody like Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, on the floor of Congress lambasting Ireland, Spain and Norway as well, but particularly Ireland, that has an impact on what American companies do and where they
just
invest.
What America thinks. I mean, I just think that, we've got to be realistic about, you shift your policy. I think it's obviously for the right reasons.
Yeah, I do
I think,
too.
Palestinians need protection, they need recognition, they need integrity, they need to be given some modicum of dignity in this entirely racist, and it is a racist ethnic cleansing plan. We're going to talk about this after the break.
Yeah.
So I think it's absolutely right that Ireland, I feel very comfortable about our country saying, hold on a second, we are going to break with America and we're going to break with the EU and we're going to go out on our own on this. I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
However, it will not be without consequences. And those consequences are out of our control. And that's what I want to talk about.
Okay, Mark, we've spoken about the history, the relationship between Ireland and Israel, and how tight it was and how aligned it was for many, many years, and then how they have diverged.
Yeah.
But we also have a huge trade agreement between ourselves and Israel.
Or trade reality.
And
we've a huge trade reality with the Arabs as well. Yeah. So you're always trying to juggle your position all the time,
Exactly. So this move by the Irish government to recognise the Palestinian state is a moral one. But it also has, as you say, consequences and commercial consequences.
And maybe more.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that.
So, John, there are three scenarios here. There is what I call the South African scenario.
Yeah.
There is the Islamicization scenario. And there is the kind of third way, which may well be the best, but all these three scenarios are out of our control. So remember I said at the very, very top, if you're a small country, you're a rule taker, right? So you're not in control at all of what happens to your foreign policy, right? Because you can't exercise the power required to get people to do what you want. So you're all in the game of persuasion. So you're basically in the lap of the gods. The South Africa scenario is the best possible scenario for Ireland. This is the one we're talking. Okay. So when the apartheid regime in the 1960s and 1970s became under increasingly international pressure from American universities and from some European countries, and of course all African countries, we had a choice. Countries had a choice. Who are you going to go with? And interestingly, like Britain and America continued to support the apartheid regime up to the end.
Yeah.
Almost, Reagan and Thatcher referred to the ANC as terrorists.
Yeah.
They referred to Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. They referred to Robben Island as a legitimate prison for terrorism. They were infused by this anti-communist fear because Mandela and the ANC were close to Russia or the Soviet Union. But up until the very end, the language of two of the biggest players in the West was very, very much the sort of language we hear now from Israel. That everybody who's against us is a terrorist and everyone's illegitimate except for us, right? Ireland in the 1980s broke ranks. And it wasn't Ireland officially, it was Irish workers.
It was Dun Stores
workers, and a whole load of the Irish trade union movement, the Irish broad left movement. There was the Reverend Terence McCaughey, Presbyterian minister, who was very, very much at the forefront of this. Kader Asmal, who was a professor of law in Trinity. Those types of people led a movement where Ireland broke ranks certainly with Britain and with lots and lots of European countries and with the United States, and began early doors to recognise the South African state as being entirely illegitimate. Then it helped that the rest of the world imposed sanctions on the South African state. And then it was very, very clear, I'm going to use the word, it was very black and white as to who was the good and the bad guys.
Yeah.
Right? The whites were the bad guys and the blacks were the good guys. And the black post-colonial liberation movements in Zambia, in what became Zimbabwe, what was Rhodesia, in Namibia, in Mozambique, and Angola. They all accorded with a broad left liberal sense of Europeans that, hold on a second, this is in effect the American South in Africa.
Yes.
White people should not be there. They're there as guests, and they are imposing this unspeakable horror on the blacks. Now, I've been to the Apartheid Museum in Joburg, and the level of kind of nastiness, everyday nastiness in apartheid was just unbelievable. The level of detail of bullshitness, right? You know, you're going to say, this is such bullshit. Like they'd stick pens in people's hair to see if their hair was a little bit curly, and then they have a little bit black blood in them. It's mad stuff, right?
What?
Yeah, there was a pen test in South Africa. So
Wow.
if you were mixed race, right?
Yeah.
And they couldn't quite put you into, are you black, are you coloured, are you this, that, and that. One of the most basic things, they stick a pen in your hair. Yeah. And if the pen fell out, because you had straight white hair, you're white. And if the pen stuck, right?
Almighty.
You're a little bit too black, right? So like when you go to a museum, like you're thinking, oh my God, the pettiness of art.
Yeah.
Right? But the criminality of it. So,
yeah, actually, just a little aside there. I went to the Native American Museum in Washington last year.
Yeah, I'd love to go to that.
Oh man, yeah, similar kind of stories, but it's horrific what went on. But anyway, that's
but the same sort of, it's the same. It's a white settler complex, right? So what I'm saying is, then Ireland moved early. The South African regime did indeed collapse, helped enormously by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mandela emerges as a transcendental character, a one in a million person, right?
Yeah.
1 in a billion person, as the only leader who can actually execute this massive transformation. So you have this confluence of sanctions by the West, the end of the Soviet Union, the emergence of Mandela as this transcendental creature, and of course, the understanding on the part of Guy de Klerk that if we want to stick around, we got to do a deal now because we're still in the ascendancy. So you get these extraordinary factors come together at this almost sort of fusion point. And what happens is apartheid disappears, like as my alpha used to say, snow off a ditch. Yeah. It's almost gone. And the people who went against apartheid first look very, very good.
Yeah.
And that is the best possible outcome now for the Irish position on Palestine. So it's that you move early, you move on the moral side, you're part of a groundswing of public opinion. Eventually the Israelis, or the Netanyahu Israelis, buckle under that pressure. There is a deal, it's a two-state deal, and you look to have been number one on the right side of history, but number two, slightly instrumental in making it happen.
Okay.
And that enhances your power.
Okay.
So that is the ideal end position. And I presume the Department of Foreign Affairs is hoping for that outcome.
Okay. What's the other one?
But there's another one, which I would call the weaponization of Palestinianism, which is, if you look at, and this is very much the mainstream American view, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. If you look at Hamas, you can take the view that the leadership of Hamas is playing a numbers game. How many Palestinians are killed? How much is the outrage? Do they care about the people who are being killed, or do they care about their own skins, right? And the Irish left, or the European left, likes to think of the Palestinians as liberal, a bit like Yasser Arafat. You know, tolerant, liberal, open-minded, all that sort of stuff, like a sort of a Western version of themselves with, you know, better jewelry. But what if you're actually dealing with, and I think we know we're dealing with, maybe something a little bit more alien. They ain't going to be hanging out with Bambi Thug.
Yes.
Right? They ain't going to be at the top of an LGBT march. They ain't saying to women, yeah, go and get educated. That's cool. Get divorced. Leave your husband. If you know, leave your husband because you're an independent woman. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
That they're actually inimical to our worldview because they're Islamicists. And they are weaponizing Palestinian trauma and tragedy to advance their cause. Now, this is the mainstream Israeli, American, I think a lot of the European capitals' views, right? We have dismissed this as wrong, but what if they're right? What if actual fact, the way this ends up is not like the nice, lovely South African story that the whites go away in a way, but they're nice and they go away and it's all fine, right? And everyone gets on. It's a rainbow nation.
Yeah.
But what if actually that doesn't happen? What if, for example, Russia doubles down on Iran?
Mm-hmm.
Iran doubles down on Hezbollah. Hezbollah doubles down on Hamas, helping them out. And what we get is an Islamic coalition against the Israelis and by extension against the Americans and the Europeans.
Yeah. And we get an ISIS-style movement.
Or an Iranian revolution. But what you get is you've got a theocratic Islamicist entity.
Yeah.
And you're in bed with them.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That actually what we're hoping is a Palestine that looks like the rainbow nation of South Africa. But we get a Palestine that looks like the Islamic Republic of Iran.
See, it's kind of interesting because back in 2006 when the elections happened and Hamas came to power by a tiny, tiny majority, like a 1% majority, it meant that almost half of the population were against Hamas.
Yeah.
But after all the intifadas and now Israel essentially shooting fish in the barrel is the greatest kind of recruitment call for Hamas and Hezbollah.
Exactly.
So that number and that percentage, I would imagine, will have shifted to the extreme. So, whether they like it or not, they end up becoming Hamas supporters. And that's the difficult bit. That's what you're talking about.
Well, what I'm talking about is we tend to think of the world through the lens of nation states, democracies, legitimacy, etc. If you see the world through the lens of a caliphate and in a religious war, that there's basically our people here and those people there, and they're non-believers and we're believers, then our worldview is inoperable.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about, lines in the sand and borders and different currencies and different tax regimes. And they're not talking about this at all. They're talking about millennial type thinking about religious war.
Yeah.
That's the risk. The risk is that that's the way it turns out. That there isn't a nice, peaceful solution, that it doesn't really work very well. It's not going to be about two rational men sitting in, with cigars saying, okay, we'll fix this thing, right? That's the way it might end up. And then in a way, you're on a side you don't necessarily want to be on. And France isn't on that side, and Germany isn't on that side, and Britain isn't, and Denmark isn't, Netherlands isn't, Italy isn't. All your EU friends are thinking, are you on our side?
What have you done?
Yeah, whose side are you on?
Yeah.
So that's the other alternative, right? And there's a third alternative, John, which is basically in the hands of the Israelis. So the first one is South Africa, it all works well. The second one is a religious war, which all ends disastrously. The third one is the Israelis have four options and they are still going to make the decision. And hopefully this decision will influence them slightly.
Yeah.
And their decision is, one, they go for ethnic cleansing. I heard, Ben Gvir saying it the other day. I'm going to live in Gaza. I'm going to do all this sort of stuff. That's one. Then Israel becomes a pariah state. More than it is at the moment.
Jared Kushner would be in there building his hotels.
Selling realty.
Realty on the waterfront.
I know. That's number one, ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
Number two, and related to that, is a genocide.
That's happening now.
Yeah, and that keeps happening, right? And that because the West is still not necessarily, because the Americans are still on the Israeli side, it's allowed to happen. Then the third one is that Israel occupies and gives citizenship to all Palestinians. But if they do that, we're back to, remember, our 14 million people, 7 million Jews, 7 million Arabs, and then Israel ceases to be a Jewish state. And therefore its raison d'etre disappears. And the Israelis won't allow that to happen. And the fourth option is the two-state solution, that they arrive at this conclusion on their own with pressure from outside. But the reason that de Klerk arrived in the 1990s was they had Mandela to deal with. They had the ANC that was backed by all sorts of powers and made legitimate. The West eventually all came around to it, and I include Thatcher and Reagan in that, who were the two big beasts. And the world was changing. It was the 1990s, the wall had come down, everything changed. We're not at that stage now. There's no big international move which is going to shift the dial.
Yeah.
So what we're still stuck in, is this an Islamic war? Is it a territorial war? Is Palestine a state in the way in which, for example, Ireland is a state that functions, right? Have we backed the right horse morally and the wrong horse geostrategically? And that is a massive, massive question. And I think that when we think about foreign policy, the easiest way to think about it is the moral way. But the tricky way to think about it is if you cannot, and understand that you cannot, determine the outcome, you've no idea when you start the journey where your destination is likely to be. And that gives you, I would think, less, not more control. And when you're a small country and you've already got very little control, I think you should think about these things.